All right. Good evening, everyone. We are here on Candid, another episode of Candid, and we will be discussing real issues, real situations, real scenarios for our time, and we are going to be discussing them through the eyes of faith. So, are we our brother's keeper? We started this discussion last week, and we talked about how us as individuals and us how as a community of faith, what is our responsibility with our brothers and sisters, not just in the church but in society. And we got into the conversation about the whole issues of race and how do we engage in this issue. Not too long ago, we were talking about whether or not we should be wearing masks and having church, even though there's still a whole COVID crisis coming in. And it boiled down to this question of, are we our brother's keeper? So, before I bring on Robert and Bill, tonight we're going to be adding in that element of corporate responsibility. Are we responsible for what goes on outside of us? Are we responsible for what goes on in our church and in our local government, our society? How far do we need to go? Just a little bit of context in that God, when he made a covenant with his people, it wasn't just for their community, but it was also for the communities that they were going to be encountering. So there's this corporate responsibility that we see in the Old Testament, and we also see that element in the New Testament with the early church and how they had all things in common and how they worked together and everything, and how they impacted their local communities. So without further ado, let me bring in Bill and Robert, and we're going to discuss what exactly this means in our context today. So let's see if I can get everybody here on screen. Robert, Bill, welcome. So let's talk about it. Let's continue our discussion when we talk about our brother's keeper. So what does that look like now, especially with what's been going on, the upheavals we've been having, not just with the whole issue of racism, but public health. How do we really engage in this today?
It's a good question, Pastor, and I think one of the challenges that we have in Western culture is that we are very independent. I mean, July 4th is called Independence Day, and so I think one of the things that we have to do as Christians is that we have to go back to maybe what the original plan was, and by the original plan, I'm talking about what happened with the early church, and see how that independence broke down, and now one person was dependent upon another, and as a result of that, the church grew exponentially, whereas today it's not growing, it's actually contracting.
Robert, what do you think?
Well, I think we see that type of independence throughout all of our society. Lorna and I used to be part of a homeowners association, and I can remember us waiting around to fix our fences behind the houses, and everybody was so anxious. We had 200 homeowners wanted to fix their house, but one guy didn't want to pay to do it, and so he sued the homeowners association and said, we're not going to fix the fence. And when I went to him and asked him, the whole group needs these fences fixed, why won't you do it? And he said, nobody's going to tell me what to do. I'm an American. And I thought, dude, that is true, but still we need our fences. They're falling down. So we kind of live in a society where it's easy to push our personal desires, needs, wants, whatever it is, over the corporate. And we've closely connected that independence to our identity, unfortunately, as Americans and as Christians and whatever. And sometimes I think we just need to step back a little and say, come on, guys, this certainly couldn't have been the way the Lord wanted us to interact with each other. When I look at the the commandments that address us, don't kill, don't steal, don't have adultery, don't covet your neighbor's things, those are all things that say the corporate has to be considered. I can't just decide what I want for myself. It's a weird thing we're living. I don't know the answer to it, but I know it's weird.
It is weird.
So I think you hit on a very interesting point that, especially now as Americans, we really promote, or rather, we really lift up this concept of individualism and individual rights, and just how our society really revolves around me as opposed to the collective. And this is really interesting because this is actually a recent phenomenon in the world. Now, if you look outside of America, you look outside of Western Europe, and you look at other nations and countries and cultures, a lot of those cultures really are more family oriented, or community oriented, and whether that's good or bad in some ways, but there was this personal responsibility to the collective. And so when we look here in America, we, like you said, we have to kind of deal and navigate with this whole individualism. But when we talk about the community of faith, do you find that as Christians that we generally tend to engage or disengage when it comes to community issues?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, I think we tend to retract a little back from the corporate people around us. Sometimes, if we're lucky, fortunate, we can see one another within the church as part of ourself, as part of our group, but part of our tribe in a sense. But sometimes we can't even see that, and it's painful, really, to see what happens when people start to push themselves above the whole group.
And I think